So Casey Sherman, author, journalist, New York Times bestselling author.
Thank you.
Screenwriter. But for this conversation, what's I think most important and what you have always taken pride in is being the nephew of Mary Sullivan, 19-year-old who was known as the final victim of the Boston Strangler. And you've committed a lot of time, your entire life, to finding answers. And I'm curious, what was it about your aunt and about this case that made you say, I'm going all in?
Well, you know what? I grew up in an Irish Catholic household on Cape Cod. Things like murder were never talked about. I didn't know my Aunt Mary. She was killed 5 years before I was born. But I saw her picture on the mantelpiece of my grandparents' home, and I felt that I knew her. And I'd heard whispers about Mary's death with regard to the Boston Strangler growing up. And when I was a teenager, I actually saw the Boston Strangler film, the first film starring Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda on TV here, in the Boston area. And I thought, geez, maybe I know the story finally for the first time. So the next day I broached the subject to my mother, Diane, who was 17 when her 19-year-old sister was taken from her. And I said, Mom, tell me about Mary. And she said, Casey, Mary just wasn't a victim. She was my sister. She was my best friend. They had planned to live their lives along parallel lines. They were going to travel together. They were going to raise their families together. They were going to grow old together as sisters. And all that was taken away from her on January 4th, 1964. Now, when she was describing this to me, that veneer that she had put up for so long began to crack. And she began to get emotional for the first time. And like any child would do, I reached my arms around her and I hugged her. And I said, Mom, at least they got the guy. And she looked up at me and she says, Casey, I don't know if they ever did. Now, my mother didn't have any evidence to back up her suspicions. It was merely a sister's intuition, kind of a bond between two sisters that couldn't be broken even after 30 to 40 years at that time. Well, that bond led me to journalism school at Boston University because I wanted to find the truth about not only what happened to Mary, but what happened to all of those women who lost their lives from June 1962 to January 1964.
Saying to your mom, well, at least they got the guy. That's Albert DeSalvo, who confessed.
Sure.
Confessed, and some may say that's great. They put the story to bed. They put the case is closed. Your mom saying I don't think that's true. Where did you start to investigate when you were like, maybe it wasn't him?
I wanted to find everybody that was still alive at the time and interview them because Albert DeSalvo, the so-called Boston Strangler, he had been murdered in the Walpole Prison Infirmary in 1973. So I didn't have him to talk to. But I reached out to his family, I reached out to his psychiatrist, I reached out to his attorneys at the time, and they all told me the same story. Albert DeSalvo was a sexual predator, he was a con man, he was a thief, but he wasn't a killer.
And he was never charged. He confessed to this, but he was never charged with the murders of the 11 women.
Correct.
That the so-called Boston Strangler killed.
It's incredible to know that, and I learned that very early on in the case, that he was never charged with any of the homicides, that the murders are still open according to the Boston Police Department. Albert DeSalvo went to prison on unrelated sex crimes that he did commit, but he was sold to the public as the Boston Strangler, which allowed the Boston Police Department, allowed the politicians in the city to kind of move on from this very sensational case in the 1960s. But while they moved on, the families of the victims stood still. And we never got justice. We never got closure. And there were so many answers that still needed to be, or so many questions rather, that still needed to be answered. And I spent, the next 3 decades trying to do so.
This new documentary that is about to come out really explores a lot of this dialogue that happens after Albert DeSalvo confessed, was then murdered, and the years that come after. And there's you and there's others who are saying, we got to dig deeper. We got to find the real answers. Then there's others who are ready to just say, no, we did it. It's over. It's done. When you see that and you hear that, what is that? How does that make you feel?
So I would say to those people, put yourself in my shoes. Put yourself in my mother's shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of any of the survivors of those victims, because although these murders happened in the 1960s, the ripple effects are still felt by their descendants today. And there's no statute of limitation on murder. Therefore, these crimes should be and can be solved.
They're getting closer, right? Where they exhumed bodies. You guys exhumed bodies, got some DNA, and do you feel that you have closure?
Never closure, because she's gone and I never got to meet her. My mother lived the rest of her days missing her sister and fighting for justice. I'm not the hero of this story. To me, it's my mother, Diane, who never gave up hope that her best friend's murder, her sister's murder, would be solved. But the holy grail in the Boston Strangler case was Albert DeSalvo's confession, because not a shred of physical evidence ever tied DeSalvo to these cases, not a fingerprint, not an eyewitness, nothing. Which is really bizarre when you think about it, because Albert DeSalvo, when you look back at the crimes he did commit, he was a bungling crook. He got arrested for just about everything that he had ever attempted. So to think that he could slip in and out of the apartments of these victims without leaving any shred of evidence behind is giving him too much credit.
Yeah.
But where were the confession tapes? What I learned through incredibly frustrating conversations with a lot of people that were connected to the case was that much of the evidence had been stolen from the Boston Police Department and stolen from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office by detectives, by police officers who were taking macabre mementos from their work on this case, because they wanted to show their grandchildren, I was the guy that caught the Boston Strangler. It wasn't true.
Well, and so these tapes, for the first time, parts of them are being released and heard. And when you sat down and listened to those in the documentary, you talk about kind of separating it as objectively listening to the facts that he was saying. And I'm sure there's a lot of emotion with it too, of being a family member. So how are you able to sit there and just truly listen?
I had to do it several times.
Yeah.
First time was very emotional, and the confession tapes had been stolen from the Boston Police Department, and they were, still missing for 40 years until I tracked down the police officer that had taken the tapes, and he allowed me to listen to them for the first time. And the first time I did listen to them, I could hear Albert DeSalvo's voice, which I'd never heard before, and he spoke in a very kind of a nasally, high-pitched tone. And when he's talking about murdering my aunt, did I get emotional? Sure.
Yeah.
And I had to, stop the tape, go back and listen to it again. And then I put that tape and all the tapes up to the autopsy reports and the crime scene reports of all the Boston stranglings. And I had to listen closely as to what Albert DeSalvo was confessing to. And ultimately, he was confessing to events that never happened.
And so that's a red flag.
That is a huge red flag. The only evidence that could tie DeSalvo to the case was now the first thing that could exonerate him from being the so-called Boston Strangler, because he wasn't just making, slight mistakes in his confession. He was making monumental mistakes, specifically with regard to how he murdered my aunt. He had claimed that he had choked her physically with his thumbs against her Adam's apple. That was not true. She was strangled with 3 ligatures, 2 scarves, and a nylon stocking, all wrapped very tightly around her neck. And when we exhumed Mary's remains for DNA testing, her hyoid bone, which is a very fragile neck bone broken in the majority of all manual strangulations, was still intact in her body. He had also claimed that he had raped Mary physically, left physical evidence inside her body. When we exhumed her remains for DNA testing, we found DNA, 2 foreign samples of DNA inside her body. They did not match Albert DeSalvo.
Which is remarkable when the physical facts don't match, and yet still,
correct, there
are those out there that say that's okay, that's just a fluke. It's right. It's still, he's still the one. So
and I would understand that
Yeah.
if there weren't real suspects out there. You know, this wasn't Jack the Ripper resurrected to stalk the women of Boston.
Yeah.
You know, to me, more terrifying to know it wasn't just one lone killer. There were several men committing these murders under the guise of this phantom fiend or this so-called serial killer. But if you hated a woman in the early 1960s, you had a blueprint for how to commit a Boston Strangler murder because all of the details were printed in the newspapers at the time. You don't see that today. You saw that in the 1960s. And the thing is, the police knew it. The police had strong suspects in the majority of these cases, including the murder of my Aunt Mary.
I think the documentary does such a great job of deconstructing this idea of the one person and looking at how it could have been multiple people and how it's okay to accept that it could have been multiple people, right? And to not have to batch it together to make it feel,
Correct.
you know, like put a bow on it. It's
Well, that's,
case
I mean,
closed.
exactly.
You know, I also want to ask about, was this the first time that you went to Mary's apartment on Charles Street?
That was probably one of the most emotional moments of my life. I made a commitment to her that I would never enter her apartment unless I found her killer, which I believe I did, but got him prosecuted, which I did not have the opportunity to do. I'd stood outside that apartment probably 50 to 60 times over the last 30 years, wondering what it looked like inside, what had happened inside. And with this documentary, the filmmakers asked me if I was willing to do so, and I did. And an incredible wave of emotion came over me because now I could visualize what had happened inside there. You know, that small, very tight apartment at 44A Charles Street in Boston, which looks very similar to what it did look like in 1964. You know, she had no way to get out of that situation. She was trapped by her killer.
When you think back on that, are you glad that you went in there?
I feel like I've done everything I can to get justice for Mary and to get justice for the families of the other victims.
Yeah.
Because I'd never want them to be lost in this conversation as well. So much is talked about or written about Albert DeSalvo, but you have the victims here. Not only Mary Sullivan, but Anna Slessors, Nina Nichols, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bassett, Beverly Sammons. These names should be rolling off everybody's tongue, but nobody knows who they are because all of the focus is on the alleged person that murdered them.
And that brings me to this career that you have built, and so much of it feels like it stemmed from such a personal place to find answers for your family and for the other victims. But you've now created a career where you are helping to find answers for others too. Is that something you thought was going to happen, or you know, like what led you here?
Sure. I mean, I call myself the accidental author. I never believed I'd be writing books one day, but that is until I was thrust into the spotlight because of the Strangler case. And I will say that, you know, families open themselves up to me. And I think that is the reason I've been as successful as I have been as an author is because I've been where they are. I can listen to them talk about their loved one, not as somebody in the past or not as somebody that is two-dimensional, but somebody that is three-dimensional and had a backstory, had a life. And, you know, I get emotional with regard to not only my aunt's murder case, but every case that I really dig into because I think about what would I do in their shoes? What would I do in the shoes of their family members that were left without answers?
When you connect with these families and when you connect with people, I'm sure there's people that you meet at
Sure.
your book tours, or, you know, even when the show at the Wilbur, I'm sure there's conversations that come up. And how does it feel to know that you are giving a voice to these victims?
You know, the first question I ask, somebody will say, my loved one was murdered. And I'll first ask, what was their name? Because I want to connect with them on a personal level, not what happened to them.
Right.
We'll get to that if we get to that. I want to know who they were as a person. And I think once the family members open up and share their memories of their loved one, then it becomes personal for me too.
In that regard, when people watch this documentary, what is it that you hope they take away?
I want them to remember these women. and the lives that they led and all of the hopes and dreams that they had that were snuffed out. I want them to understand that the killers were never caught or convicted, and that these murders are still unsolved, and that they should be solved. And I would like them to, put themselves in the shoes of not only me, but the other families that have gone through decades of ordeal without the answers that should have been given to them decades ago.
In a case like this and so many other cases right now, there's a lot of media around it, and there has been, and some of it's correct, some of it's incorrect. Hollywood likes to jump on board and make something of some of these cases, and some people come in and ask questions that help fulfill their story,
Sure.
help shape their story. So is there anything that no one has asked you that you wish they did?
That is a great question. People don't ask me why you continue to do what you do. I've been asked by people, why don't you just put it away? Not why are you continuing to move forward here? And I would say that I do so not only to honor my aunt's memory, but now to honor the memory of my mother, who I lost last year. One of our last conversations while she was alive was about Mary, her sister that she knew she was going to hopefully reunite with, because my mother was very sick. And she said, you did everything you could for her. And I'm going to tell her that when I see her. Now they're both, buried side by side in a cemetery on Cape Cod.
A happy ending to a pretty horrible
For her, I hope
mid-story,
so.
right?
Yeah.
A beautiful start, hopefully, to their lives, or it
Correct.
sounds like it, and
Yeah.
rocky in between, but hopefully a happy reunion.
Thank you very much. I agree.
As we look ahead here to all that you're doing, this is going to come out. Then we have the show at the Wilbur.
Yes.
Casey, what's next?
So I publish a book a year. So I just finished a book called The Killer and Frank Lloyd Wright. The world's greatest architect was involved in a mass murder early in his career, which shifted his approach to designing homes. And when I sold this to my publisher, they asked me really what it was about, and I teased them this way. I said it's Romeo and Juliet meets The Shining.
Oh.
And that book comes out in May of next year, and hopefully we'll be back talking about it when it does.
Romeo and Juliet meets The Shining.
Yeah.
That's a tease.
That's a tease. Yeah, exactly.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for
so
taking the
much.
time.
Oh, thank you for having me.